Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 1, verses 7 through 11. It is right for me to feel this way about you all, because I hold you in my heart. For you are all partakers with me of grace, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. For God is my witness, how I yearn for you all with the affection of Christ Jesus, and it is my prayer that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and all discernment, so that you may approve what is excellent, and so be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. Did you listen carefully to those words from Paul? It's not every day you hear someone talking like that. There are many people, and you might be one of them, who grew up rarely hearing our fathers or mothers telling us, I love you. And because we don't often express our genuine love for each other in words, sometimes it can make us uncomfortable when conversations with friends and loved ones err on the side of mushy. Men in particular feel like it's not macho to tell their friends and brothers that they love them. But Paul was a real man. He was courageous. He was a leader. He was a craftsman. He went on his fair share of voyages. He was bitten by snakes. He had come face to face with demonic forces. His words left a tremendous impact on countless people. Of course, it was God doing all this through him, but the point still remains. Paul was a real man, and he wasn't afraid to express his love for others. Listen again to how he wrote to this church. In verse 7, it is right for me to feel this way about you all, because I hold you in my heart, for you are all partakers with me of grace, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. If anyone asked Paul, why do you like that church in that city so much? He'd say, I have good reason to. It's right for me to feel that way. It's interesting language about feelings. It's right for me to feel this way for Paul to use, because we know that even though Christian love is not entirely wrapped up into feelings and emotions, those things are indeed part of it. Paul's love for this church was so deep for multiple reasons. For one, this was his first church plant. Sure, Paul had spoken in synagogues and visited the churches in Antioch, but he actually helped to establish, or charter, we would say today, this church in Philippi. The first church where you truly get plugged in will always hold a special place in your heart and mind. The first church I was involved in, playing drums in the worship band, teaching midweek classes, and working with the youth group, certainly had its problems, but that congregation, that sanctuary, and even that denomination will always be dear to me. So imagine how Paul must have felt about this church. This was likely the first congregation he knew intimately, at least from the position of planter and pastor. On top of that, this church had few problems. And any problems they did have were far outweighed by their constant partnership with Paul. They remained his gospel partners through thick and thin. They backed up his ministry whether he was in jail or preaching in the streets. So just know that if you have found your people, if you've connected with other believers, if you have bonded over the Bible with your brothers, if your pastor is your partner and your church is your team, it is right for you to feel overjoyed with love for them. He goes on to say in verses 8 through 11, for God is my witness, how I yearn for you all with the affection of Christ Jesus, and it is my prayer that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and all discernment, so that you may approve what is excellent, and so be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. The Apostle Paul had a long prayer list. He prayed for every church to which he sent a letter. And you can discover this for yourself if you go to Romans, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Timothy, Philemon. He prayed for each of the congregations represented in those letters, and all that being said, I can't help but thinking he particularly loved praying for the Philippian church. And in this letter, he prays a specific request for them, that their love, knowledge, and discernment would increase. The Philippians were a loving bunch. Paul had first-hand experience with that. But there was an even deeper level of affection for them to discover, a kind of love that is founded on knowledge and discernment. Christian love is not unguided or without boundaries. Our message is not all you need is love, or love is love, or any other sappy cultural maximum about so-called love. Instead, Christian love is backed by knowledge. It all starts with our love for God. What good is it to say, I love the Lord, if you've got no clue who he is? This was the error of the Jews in Jesus' day. They loved their religion. They loved the idea of God, but they did not truly know God. Paul will say in Romans 10, brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them, these are the Jews, is that they may be saved, for I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. Loving the worship music, or the free meal in the fellowship hall, or all the trappings of religion, is not the same as loving God. But if you just ask around, you'll see that many people are quick to say, I love the Lord, but they don't hardly know who he is. But when you truly love someone, well, what do? You research, you study them, you ask questions, you spend time with them, you get to know them. And by getting to know them, you end up loving them more. This is the deeper love that is built on knowledge and discernment, or the Greek word aesthesis, which means perception or judgment. This word depicts an artist or a decorator who examines patterns and designs to determine looks that are aesthetically pleasing. You hear that Greek word in that English word we have. So Christian love is not blind. It has a keen eye. It employs discernment. It looks at doctrines and courses of action and other areas of the Christian life in order to, as Paul says, approve what is excellent. Now, I say this at the risk of sounding like you can achieve purity by perfecting your love through discernment, but it is true that a combination of love, knowledge, and discernment will result in a more pure church. Here's what I mean. And it's not that you can get sanctified by getting smarter. Later on in this letter, Paul warns this church about people who have infiltrated them with wrong ideas about God's grace. These religious teachers were cool with Jesus and all, but they mixed in some additives to the gospel. Things like circumcision, dietary restrictions, and I'm sure the list goes on. We must not love these kinds of doctrines. Ideas that pollute salvation by grace through faith ought to be weeded out by our discernment. In so doing, the church and the message inside of it remains pure. The Greek word for pure or sincere, by the way, references something that has been judged by sunlight. This word employed by Paul is a nod to the ancient pottery industry in which cracked pots could cause sales to plummet. So cunning merchants would seal cracks and piece products back together using wax. A great idea. The only problem? Wax melts in the heat. So if you held up a pot to the sunlight, a couple of things would happen. One, you could see rays of light shining through any of the cracks which had been filled. And two, if you left it out too long, the structural integrity of the pot would collapse, and you would have learned the hard way that you purchased damaged goods. For all these reasons, pottery vendors began to write a Latin phrase on their pieces of pottery in order to convey the quality and value of their product. That phrase was sine cera, sincere is what our word that comes from that is, and it literally means without wax. True love for God, the church, and your neighbor, true righteousness that comes by faith, see chapter 3, verse 9 of Philippians, and does not come by works, unlike wax, never melts away. People who live on the pretense that their own goodness is saving them will eventually crumble like a cheap pot in the hands of a clumsy customer. Those who are partakers of grace, like Paul says in verse 7, and are filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Christ, like he says in verse 11, will stand the test of eternity.